Likutey Halakhot on Shulchan Aruch Yoreh Day'ah. Rebbe Noson, follower of Rebbe Nachman of Breslov. Laws of Bonded Servants. Law 1. Based on the lesson in Likutey Halakhot, Part 119, continued from Laws of Circumcision, Halacha 1. The master is obligated to circumcise his bonded servant, and then the servant becomes obligated in the commandments in which a Jewish woman is obligated. Yoreh Day'ah 267. This is because a bonded servant is the financial possession of the master, and all souls are rooted in wealth. Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 69. So when one purchases a bonded servant, and he becomes one's financial possession, the servant thus enters into the root of the master's soul. Now, the soul corresponds to the holy malchut, Tikkunei Zohar, number 21, page 49a, whereas a bonded servant is the antithesis of the holy malchut, as in, the world is enraged by three things when a bonded servant becomes king, Proverbs 30:22. For a bonded servant is the filth of the serpent, as in, cursed is Canaan, Genesis 9:25, and in, cursed are you there, 3:14, as cited, Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 117, which corresponds to the evil malchut that corresponds to the serpent that is the antithesis of the holy malchut. That is why when a bonded servant enters into Jewish possession to become the financial possession of a Jewish person, he must be circumcised in order to subdue the foreskin, which is the all-encompassing evil, which is the filth of the serpent, that is the evil malchut, so that it will be subjugated under Jewish authority to become Jewish possession, which corresponds to a Jewish soul, which corresponds to the holy malchut as said. At that point, the servant becomes obligated in the commandments in which a Jewish woman is obligated, for once he has become the Jewish master's soul, which corresponds to the feminine, from which money arises, as the Rebbe cites Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 69. For all money is from the realm of the feminine that corresponds to soul. The bonded servant therefore becomes obligated in the commandments in which a Jewish woman is obligated, for money and financial possessions correspond to woman, as said, and the bonded servant is one's financial possession. Law 2. Regarding the circumcision of bonded servants. Based upon the lesson in Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 51, that revolves around, when you reach the pure marble stones, do not declare, water, water. For it is said, one who speaks falsehoods will not endure before me, Psalms 101:7. Study this entire lesson very well. Section 1. In sum, if we want after creation to be as before creation, that Father and Son will be as one, that everything will be entirely one, entirely good, we must avoid falsehood. For through truth God's providence is upon us, and everything is one. For through His providence, after creation merges into before creation, and Father and Son become as one, whereas through falsehood, we banish God's providence from ourselves. For one who speaks falsehood will not endure before me, for the truth is one, whereas falsehood is distant from one. As in, they have sought many calculations, Ecclesiastes 7:29. And the main power of falsehood, which is evil, which is defilement, is on account of its distance from one, since duality began immediately after creation, which correspond to creation and before creation. From there, falsehood devolved, which is evil, whereas before creation, everything was entirely good, entirely holy, and even the concept of purity was impossible to name. For purity only began after creation, since purity implies that there is defilement, which is the realm of the Levite, the realm of the left, from which the power of the realm of evil, which is falsehood, devolves. That is why we are able to ascend from defilement to purity, For the devolution of the power of defilement comes from purity, as in, you shall purify the sons of Levi, Numbers 8:6. Study this entire subject there, for it is very, very profound. Section 2. This corresponds to the mitzvah of circumcising bonded servants. The foreskin, which is the filth of the serpent, corresponds to falsehood, which is the evil, which is the defilement. Corresponding to the filth of the serpent, Tikkunei Zohar, number 22, page 66a. For when we remove the foreskin, what remains is a seal of truth, as in a sign of truth. Joshua 2:12, which corresponds to the Holy Covenant after removing the foreskin that covers the covenant, which corresponds to falsehood, as in betraying the seal of the king. Zohar, part 2, 3b. This is because the image of God, the image of the form of his structure, so to speak, is the circumcised human being who has been sealed with the seal of truth. But when the foreskin covers the covenant, this corresponds to falsehood, for this is not a human form at all. For as long as one has a foreskin, one is utterly deformed. As Rashi explains God's instruction to Abraham to circumcise himself, "Walk before me and be whole," Genesis 17:1. Study there. Hence, the foreskin corresponds literally to falsehood, for one is falsifying the human form, since in fact the foreskin is not part of the human form at all, and its attachment to the human being is utterly false. It appears to be part of the human body, when in truth it is not at all, for that is not the human form. The human form, the image of God, is when one is sealed with the Holy Covenant, with the seal of the sign of truth, through the removal of the foreskin, when one is called whole, as said. It is also explained in many places that guarding the covenant corresponds to the mitzvah of circumcision, which corresponds to truth, as in entirely seed of truth, Jeremiah 2:21. Whereas the opposite, a blemishing of the covenant, corresponds to the foreskin that covers the covenant, which corresponds to falsehood, which is the filth of the serpent. This corresponds to a bonded servant who is cursed, as in, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants," which refers to the seed of Ham, to a blemishing of the covenant, to the filth of the serpent, to whom it was said, "Cursed are you," Tikkunei Zohar, number 18, page 37a. Hence the foreskin, which corresponds to falsehood, to the filth of the serpent, corresponds to a bonded servant who is cursed, as said. For a bonded servant corresponds to the falsehood that is empowered by the devolution of after creation. For it is through falsehood that after creation is not merged into before creation, as said, since one who speaks falsehood will not endure before me, and then father and son are not as one. Then one falls into bondage, for the bonded servant is the antithesis of the son. For as son, after creation is merged into before creation, as in father and son as one. Specifically, father and son, for the son and father are one, since the son comes from the mind of the father, which is why as son, father and son are inevitably as one, and after, creation is merged into before creation, for the son and the father are indeed one, as said. However, on account of falsehood, father and son are thereby not as one, which is the realm of a bonded servant, for the servant is distant from the master, and is not considered as one with him. Hence, the bonded servant corresponds to falsehood, to the foreskin, to distance from one, since the entirely one, which is that after creation will be as before creation, is only through the realm of son, as in father and son as one, specifically father and son, as said. A bonded servant corresponding to falsehood, which corresponds to the filth of the serpent, is alluded to elsewhere in the Rebbe's writings. Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 117. Study there. Section 3. The Torah thus instructs us to circumcise a son in order to remove the foreskin, which is the falsehood, so that providence will be channeled upon us in order that after creation will be as before creation, as in Father and Son as one, as in entirely one, which is the essence of our service and the essence of the ultimate purpose, to merge after creation into before creation. This is because the foreskin corresponds to the clouds that cover the eyes, on account of which God's providence does not reach the individual, because the foreskin is a blemishing of the covenant, which is a blemishing of the eyes, Likutey Halakhot, Part 1:7. Whereas, when we remove the foreskin that covers the covenant, we thereby remove the clouds that cover the eyes, through which God's providence is upon us, through which Father and Son are as one, for through this one leaves the category of a bonded servant, which corresponds to falsehood, and enters the category of Son, when everything is entirely one, as in Father and Son as one, as said. The obligation to circumcise a child is incumbent mainly upon the father, Yoreh Day'ah 260, because before creation and after creation also correspond to Father and Son, as explained in the lesson. For God is called Father, and the totality of creation is called Son, and as soon as creation emerged from potential to actualization, the power of falsehood, which is the foreskin, came about. Thus we must remove the foreskin, so that Father and Son will be as one, and specifically through the Father circumcising his Son, this arousal from below causes an arousal on high for God, who is our Father, thereby removes the foreskin, which is the falsehood, from the totality of creation, so that Father and Son will be as one. Hence, the essence of the mitzvah of circumcision is to eradicate falsehood, which is the foreskin, which corresponds to a bonded servant, to evil and defilement, so that the seal and sign of truth will be revealed, so that after creation will be as before creation, corresponding to Father and Son as one, as said. Section 4. The Torah thus instructs to circumcise a bonded servant in order to subdue and eradicate the foreskin at its root, which corresponds to bonded servant, who is the antithesis of a son, and who corresponds to after creation, when it is not merged into before creation, on account of which falsehood becomes attached, and then creation is not a son, but a bonded servant. And then the foreskin, which corresponds to falsehood, is empowered. Thus, when we circumcise a bonded servant, we subdue the foreskin in its realm, at its root, for that is its realm, in the realm of the bonded servant. And when we subdue and remove the foreskin from the bonded servant, then even the bonded servant is able to merge into Son, for the essence of servitude is due to the power of falsehood, on account of which one becomes distanced from one, and then one is not in the category of son, but of bonded servant. Whereas, when we remove the foreskin, which is falsehood, then the servant is merged into son, and everything is then entirely good. As stated in the Holy Zohar, every Jewish person must serve God on two levels, both as son and as servant. And when one's service is comprised of these two levels of son and servant, then one's service is complete. Part 3, 111b. This can be explained based on the above. Before creation, everything was entirely one, but as soon as creation emerged from potential to actualization, there were immediately two dimensions, before creation and after creation, from which devolved the power of the realm of evil, which is falsehood. This corresponds to right and left, son and servant. For before creation, everything was right, with no left at all, whereas the totality of creation compared to before creation is in the category of left, as can be understood from the Rebbe's words in this lesson. From this devolved all the aspects of right and left that exist everywhere. They all devolved from these two dimensions. This corresponds to son and bonded servant. Son is when after creation is merged into before creation, as in Father and Son as one, whereas servant is when it is not merged. Hence, Son corresponds to before creation, for since Father and Son have merged as one, there is then no difference between before creation and afterward, which is why Son corresponds to before creation, whereas servant corresponds to after creation, as said. This also corresponds to right and left, for the right corresponds to before creation, as said, while left corresponds to after creation, as said. Our entire service is to merge left into right for every single individual, to the extent that they are able through their service to subdue the realm of evil that is attached to the left, so that the left will be merged into the right. To that extent is after creation merged into before creation, which is the ultimate purpose of our entire service, as said. That is why we must serve God in both ways, both as son and as servant, which correspond to right and left, so that left will be merged into right, so that after creation will be merged into before creation, as said. This corresponds to the circumcision of bonded servants. By circumcising the servant and removing from him the foreskin, which is falsehood, which is mainly attached to realm of servant, the servant is thereby merged into son, left into right, for though he is still a servant, nevertheless, that is the essence of the service, that servant, the left, should be merged into the right, into son. That is why the servant is then obligated in the commandments in which a Jewish woman is obligated, for he is in the category of left, of woman, and by having removed the foreskin from him, he is then able to be merged into the holy left, and then the left is merged into the right, for the holy left is inherently merged into the right. Wherever there are left and right, our service is to subdue the evil that is attached to the left, through which the left is merged into the right, through which after creation is merged into before creation. Furthermore, the bonded servant is the master's financial possession, which corresponds to left, as in, at its left, wealth, Proverbs 3:16. And by subduing the foreskin that is attached to one's possession and wealth, which corresponds to left, which itself corresponds to servant, as said, the left is thereby merged into the right, and through that is after creation merged into before creation, which is the ultimate purpose of our entire service, as said. Section 5. This corresponds to the prohibition of emancipating a bonded servant, as written, "You shall bequeath them to your sons after you, and work them forever." Leviticus 25:46. Gittin 38b. This is because the service and sorting out to subdue and dispel the evil that is attached to the totality of creation, so that it will be merged into before creation, must be done all the days of our lives, in every single generation, until the end of days, until the spirit of defilement will completely disappear from the world, when everything will be subjugated to the truth and everything will return to its source, when everything will, one as it was before creation. However, now, as long as God desires the existence of the world, we must see that our entire service is in a racing forward and retreating fashion, meaning that the entire creation is merged into before creation, but that nevertheless, the existence of the world will not be completely negated, for God desires the existence of the world. That is why the essence our service is to sort out, elevate, and merge the left into the right, but yet allow for the left to exist, for the realm of the left is the perpetuation of the world, as known. That is why it is forbidden to emancipate bonded servants, so that the left will not be completely negated, but that it only be contended with by eradicating the foreskin, that which is completely evil, so that afterward, through the Jewish person working with it, he will thereby be able to sort out from the good, and the left will merge into the right, the bonded servant into the son. So, the bonded servant should not be completely emancipated, for that would completely negate the left prematurely, for we must not completely negate the left until the end of days. This is, "You shall bequeath them to your sons after you," specifically your sons, for the bonded servant must serve the son, so that the servant will be merged into the son, the left into the right, so that through that will, after creation, be merged into before creation, as said. For the more that the left is merged into the right, the more that after creation is merged into before creation, as said. Section 6. This corresponds to the Omer counting and Shavuot. It is said that during the Omer counting, we ascend from defilement to purity through the counting of the Omer days. Since during this time we purify ourselves of the defilement of Egypt in order to be worthy of receiving the Torah on Shavuot, Zohar, Part 3, 97a. The apparent question is, though, how does this counting of days purify us? What is the connection of counting days to purification? However, based on what has been said, it is very clear. The main power of the realm of evil, which is falsehood, which is evil and defilement, is in number. Since before creation, everything was entirely one, entirely good, and in one the entire concept of number is irrelevant. As written, what can you count before one? Sefer Yetzirah, chapter 1. However, as soon as God took creation from potential to actualization, numeration immediately began, for there were immediately 2 dimensions, as the Rebbe writes in the lesson. And when there are 2 dimensions, it is possible to count. And this devolved into the power of the realm of evil, which corresponds to the many calculations, meaning that it is numeration and the distance from one that devolves into many calculations, which corresponds to the power of the realm of evil, which corresponds to falsehood, which is distant from one, as said. Hence, the ultimate power of the realm of evil, which is falsehood, which is defilement, comes from numeration. But the root of number in holiness, before it devolved into defilement, which is immediately after creation, the moment that numeration came into existence, but while it was still in holiness, corresponds to purity, as explained in the lesson. In other words, immediately after creation, as soon as there were 2, as soon as there was numeration, which would then devolve until defilement came into existence. Nevertheless, before it devolved, it was considered purity, as explained in the lesson. That is why whoever seeks to leave defilement must ascend to purity. For purity, which corresponds to after creation, to number, is the root of defilement, which is why specifically through it we ascend from defilement to purity, as explained well in the lesson. That is why after we have left Egypt from bondage to freedom, since Egypt is from the seed of Ham, who corresponds to a blemishing of the covenant, the filth of the serpent, as in a servant of servants, we therefore purify ourselves from the defilement of Egypt in order to leave defilement for purity. That is why God instructed us to count the Omer, for specifically by counting, which is the root of the power of defilement, specifically through that, we ascend from defilement to purity. For number corresponds to purity, for it purifies from all defilements, since it is the root of defilement, as said, and as written, you shall purify yourselves from all defilement. Ezekiel 36:25, as explained in the lesson. For holy numeration, which corresponds to immediately after creation, that is, a truthful numeration without any falsehood, which corresponds to numeration with holiness and purity, which is guarded from falsehood, protected from the power of the realm of evil, which is falsehood and defilement. Such numeration that is after creation is merged into before creation, and such numeration becomes entirely one, as said. That is why when we must leave the defilement of Egypt, when we need purification, for specifically through purification are we able to ascend from defilement, as said, we therefore must count of the Omer, which corresponds to holy numeration, which corresponds to purity, through which we ascend from defilement. For holy numeration is merged into before creation, into entirely one, as said. This is what is written regarding the beginning of creation. There was evening and there was morning, one day. Genesis 1:5, one day, rather than the first day, so that the entire creation would be merged into one. into entirely one, entirely good, so that all subsequent numbers that would come into existence after creation would all be merged and counted into one, so that everything would be merged into entirely one. That is why the Torah attributed a number to all the days of creation, counting every single day, as written, the second day, the third day, and so forth, so that numeration, which corresponds to after creation, would be merged into holiness, so that through that all numeration, which is the totality of creation, be merged into one. That is why the Torah began numeration from one rather than the first. For by the Holy Torah, counting the numbers of the days of creation, the entire creation, which corresponds to numeration, as said, was merged into before creation, into entirely one. Section 7. This corresponds to our sages' teaching that the Jewish people should not be counted, for a curse comes wherever there is a counting, Yoma 22b, which is why the Torah instructed that whenever the Israelites had to be counted, a weight in silver should be given to represent each individual that was to be counted. Exodus 38:26. Furthermore, the Holy Zohar states that the Israelites were blessed before the counting as well as afterward, Part 2, 187b, all so that they would be protected from the curse that is attached to number and counting, as explained in the Holy Zohar. This is because the ultimate power of the curse, which corresponds to the curse of Canaan and that of the serpent, devolves from number and counting, which is precisely why it is forbidden to count the Jewish people, so that the curse that is attached to number, as in, they sought many calculations, would have no power over them. That is why charity was taken from them for the counting, for through charity we are spared from the power of that curse, and falsehood, which is defilement, which is the curse, annas, can then not attach itself to after creation, such that after creation can be merged into before creation, into entirely one. All this is achieved through charity, for charity rescues from death, Proverbs 10:2, meaning that it subdues the realm of death, which is the realm of evil, which is the defilement that is attached to after creation. Then, after creation is merged into before creation, into entirely one, which is the essence of charity, for the essence of charity is to bind the left to the right, which corresponds to the merging of after creation into before creation, which corresponds to entirely one. For charity corresponds to truth, as stated, Zohar, Part 3, 89b. For the essence of charity corresponds to truth, to Jacob, as in judgment and charity for Jacob, Psalms 99:4, and grant truth to Jacob, Micha 7:20, as the Rebbe explains elsewhere, Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 251. That is why, through charity, which corresponds to the binding of truth and faith, after creation is merged into before creation, into entirely one. For charity joins and binds all world, such that they are merged into their root, into entirely one. Thus, specifically through charity, through that weight of silver, we are spared from the grip of the realm of evil, which corresponds to the curse on account of the numeration. For we have merged number into holiness, into before creation, into entirely one, through the charity, and then the curse. The realm of evil has no power at all, for its entire power is only on account of the distance from one, as said. However, when we bind numeration to one, meaning merging after creation into before creation, then evil has no power at all. All this is accomplished through the charity that was taken in the form of the weight of silver, through which everything was bound to one. But furthermore, that charity went to purchase the public offerings, and through the offerings they bound all worlds to their original root, as stated in the Holy Zohar. Offerings ascend to the infinite, Part 3, 239a. Study there. Through the offering, we elevate the animal to the level of human, and then left is merged into right, animal into human, and after creation is merged into before creation. For after creation compared to before creation is like animal compared to human, since the essence of the human being is the intelligence that comes from entirely one from before creation, while the essence of animal is a lack of intelligence that comes from after creation, and through the offering is everything merged into entirely one, entirely good. Hence, through the charity that represented each soul, which was the weight of silver, they were thereby spared from the power of the curse, inherent in the counting. For through that was everything made into entirely good, as said. For charity corresponds to truth, through which everything is entirely one, as said, since truth is dependent upon the Ancient One. Zohar, Part 3, 140b. And there is no left in the Ancient One, there, 129a. Hence, truth is entirely right, which corresponds to entirely one. This is a weight in silver for the Galgalit, literally, skull, for the Zohar says there. When going to count, they gave a gift to the Ancient of Days, there, 128b. This means that when there is numeration, when there is fear of many calculations, we then give a weight in silver for the Galgalit, through which we bind ourselves to the skull, which corresponds to the Ancient One, to truth, as in, the head of your word is truth, Psalms 119, 160, which is entirely right, entirely one. And when it is entirely one, then evil has no power and is completely negated, as said. Section 8. This corresponds to the Omer counting in order to ascend from defilement to purity through the counting of the Omer, which corresponds to holy numeration that is merged into its root, into entirely one, specifically through which we ascend from defilement to purity, as said, in counting the days of the Omer, as well as the bringing of the Omer offering, which also corresponds to this, as said. So that after creation will merge into before creation through the merging of left into right, animal into human, since the barley offering is animal food, as stated in the Holy Zohar, Part 3, 98a, and as cited earlier several times, as well as by the raising of the Omer offering to God and sacrificing it. We thereby elevate the entire creation to be merged into before creation through raising to God the barley Omer offering, which corresponds to animal, to after creation, as said. That is why after that we begin counting the 7 weeks of the Omer, corresponding to the 7 days of creation, to bind the entire creation that was created in the 7 days of creation, which corresponds to numeration. For after creation began with numeration, as said, binding it all to the Omer offering, which corresponds to binding after creation to before creation, which corresponds to the raising of the Omer offering, as said. And specifically through that counting we ascend from defilement to purity, and are purified from the defilement of the bondage that was in Egypt, which was the site of the ultimate bondage, corresponding to Ham, the ancestor of Egypt, as said. This is because the essence of the filth of bondage, which is defilement, corresponding to foreskin, to a blemishing of the covenant, to the defilement of Egypt, to falsehood, is entirely on account of the distance from one, and their power is only from number and numeration, as said. But now they are ameliorated at their root, meaning that through holy numeration, in that the Omer counting has been merged into one, they are thereby ameliorated at their root, and their power is dispelled. For all number, which is after creation, is merged into before creation, into entirely one, at which point they have no power at all. This topic is also discussed in Laws of the Signs of Kosher Animals, Halakha 4, Section 14. Study there. Section 9. This corresponds to the immersion of a bonded servant, which is to elevate him from defilement to purity, from falsehood, which corresponds to the many calculations, so that he ascend to purity, from which the forces of evil draw their nourishment, and in which they are ameliorated and purified, as said. Thus, all immersions are in the waters of a mikveh, for the waters correspond to before creation. Since water preceded creation, Rashi, Genesis 1:1, which is because water corresponds to loving kindness, to the right, which corresponds to before creation. By entering into the water with the entire body, dissolving as if and disappearing into the water, through that one dissolves and merges into before creation, and then one is within the entirely one, at which point one is purified and ascends from all defilements, for all defilements are dissolved there in the entirely one, since their power is only on account of the distance from one, as said. Thus, when the Israelites came close to God, it was also through circumcision and immersion. Likutey 9a. Laws of Proselytes. Section 10. This corresponds a proselyte who comes to convert, also requiring circumcision and immersion in order to subdue the foreskin, which is the evil, which is the defilement of the Gentile nations, as in, all the nations are uncircumcised. Jeremiah 9:25. For the nations correspond to falsehood, whereas the Jewish people correspond to truth, as written. The remnant of Israel will not speak falsehood. Zephaniah 3:13. Thus, all the nations are considered as having a foreskin. As our sages said, the foreskin is attributed entirely to the nations. Nedarim 31b. For the foreskin corresponds to falsehood, to the defilement of the nations. That is why a proselyte cannot enter into Jewish holiness other than through circumcision and immersion. For by removing the foreskin, which is the falsehood, the defilement of the nations, which is the falsehood, thereby disappears from him, and then he is considered entirely one, entirely good, thereby returning to Jewish holiness, as said. And the circumcision must be done before the immersion. Yoreh Day'ah 268:1. Because we must first remove the foreskin, which is the falsehood, and then he is able to attain purity by merging in the water into before creation. For as long as he possesses a foreskin, which is falsehood, he is unable to merge into before creation, which corresponds to immersion, as said. Only after the filth of the foreskin is removed from him does he too become part of the sign of truth, and then he is able to receive the purification through immersion in water by merging into before creation, into entirely one. Since he cannot merge into before creation, meaning that after creation will be as before creation, that Father and Son are as one, other than by refraining from falsehood, as said, which corresponds to the removal of the foreskin, which corresponds to falsehood. Section 11. This corresponds to the court of three that must oversee the process of the circumcision and immersion of a proselyte, which our sages derived from the verse that uses the word judgment in relation to a proselyte. Just as judgment is with three, so too does a proselyte need three to convert. Yevamot 46b. Every judgment and ruling requires three, for judgment and ruling is to subdue falsehood and clarify the truth, which is the essence of ruling and judgment before judges. For only one of the litigants is telling the truth, while the other one is lying. The judge's role is to clarify the truth and subdue falsehood, which is why they must subdue falsehood at its root in every judgment and ruling, which means they must bind themselves to entirely one, to the merging of the entire creation into before creation, into Father and Son as one, through which the falsehood is completely negated and has no power at all, since everything is entirely one. This merging of after creation into before creation, which is accomplished through the truth by the judges passing an authentically true ruling, has three aspects. For it is comprised of three dimensions that are the totality of the existence of worlds, the right, the left, and the middle, which exist everywhere, since everything is rooted in the One. Before creation emerged from potential to actualization, corresponds to entirely right, for there is no left there, as said, paragraph 7. After creation, when creation had emerged from potential to actualization, corresponds to the left, in contrast to before creation, while immediately upon creation, emerging from potential to actualization, there was immediately an impression for the devolution of the realm of evil, which is falsehood and defilement. Our entire service is to subdue the falsehood, which is the realm of evil, in order to restore and merge after creation into before creation, so that even after creation will be entirely one, entirely good, just as before creation, and then falsehood will completely disappear, as said. This merging of after creation into before creation, such that even after creation will the entire creation be merged into before creation by binding the entire creation through the truth to its root, into entirely one, corresponds to the third dimension, which is the middle, the decisive middle path that binds and joins the left and the right, which corresponds to the bonding and merging of after creation into before creation. This corresponds to the totality of Jewish holiness, which is comprised of priests, Levites, and Israelites, who correspond to the three forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all of which correspond to these three dimensions of right, left, and the decisive middle path, as said. Thus, when a ruling must be given in order to banish falsehood and clarify the truth, three judges corresponding to these three dimensions are required, for a court corresponds to right, left, and the decisive middle path. As our sages said, no court can be even numbered. Sanhedrin 3b. That is why through these three judges who correspond to those three dimensions is after creation merged into before creation, into entirely one, through which is falsehood subdued. For its power is only on account of its distance from one, for wherever left is merged into the right through the decisive middle path, to that extent is after creation merged into before creation. That is why when a proselyte comes to convert, his entering into Jewish holiness is only by removing from him the falsehood, which is the foreskin, and merging him into before creation through the immersion in water, specifically through which he leaves defilement for purity, by having entered into the entirely one as said. So there must be three to oversee his circumcision and immersion, just as a ruling of judgment, because removing him from the defilement of the nations who correspond to the foreskin, to falsehood, and to elevate him into the holiness of the Jewish people who correspond to truth is literally a judgment, which is to banish falsehood and clarify the truth, all of which brought about through three, who are comprised of those three dimensions, as said, through whom after creation is merged into before creation, specifically through which we ascend from defilement to purity and falsehood, which is the evil and the defilement, is completely dispelled at its root by having merged after creation into before creation, into entirely one, entirely good. This is because the power of falsehood and defilement is only on account of the distance from one, but through a court of three judges who are comprised of the three dimensions, through whom everything is merged into entirely one. Through that evil is completely negated, and we leave defilement for purity, and even a proselyte is able through them to enter into Jewish holiness, as said. Section 12. This corresponds to the priestly blessing. The priests correspond to the right, which corresponds to before creation, as said, from where all blessings come, for the power of curse is only from after creation, as said. That is why Aaron the priest lifted up all of the Levites, Numbers 8:11. For the Levites correspond to purity, to after creation, from where devolve many calculations, which corresponds to the realm of evil. That is why a priest had to lift up the Levites, so that after creation would merge into before creation, into entirely one, so that the grip of the realm of evil that comes from the distance from one would be dispelled. This corresponds to the priests blessing the Israelites before and after a census, as stated in the Holy Zohar, cited above, paragraph 7. Number corresponds to after creation, from where evil devolved. As said, so therefore a priestly blessing was required before and after accounting, so that the people would be merged into before creation, in which is blessing, so that curse, which is empowered by numeration, which corresponds to after creation, as said, would be disempowered, which is also why the people had to give a weight of silver for a head, as said, and also why the priestly blessing is triple, as said. Section 13. This corresponds to Shavuot, on which the Torah was given after the people had counted the days of the Omer, through which they were purified from the filth of Egypt, from servitude, from the foreskin, from falsehood, all as said earlier. After that, it is possible to receive the Torah, which is a Torah of truth, on Shavuot, for through the Torah we bind all worlds together, and after creation is merged into before creation, for ultimately this is accomplished through the Torah of truth. That is why the entire Torah is tripled. As our sages said, "Blessed is God who gave us a triple Torah through the third born on the third day of the third month." Shabbat 88a. For the Torah corresponds to truth, to peace, which is comprised of three dimensions, as said, through which after creation is merged into before creation, which is the ultimate purpose of everything, which is accomplished through the commandments of the Torah. This corresponds to the world stands upon three things, upon justice, upon truth, and upon peace. As said, adjudicate truth, justice, and peace in your gates. Zechariah 8:16, Avot 1:17. These three are actually one, and each is comprised of three dimensions, and together they are the above three dimensions upon which the world stands. The perpetuation of the world is when after creation is merged into before creation, into entirely one, which is the ultimate purpose of all creation, for which purpose the world was created, as known. This is accomplished through these three dimensions: 1. Justice and judgment, for through a true judgment that subdues falsehood and clarifies, the truth is after creation, merged into before creation. 2. Truth, and 3. Peace. Truth also corresponds to the above, in that everything is dependent upon truth, through which God's providence is upon us, and through which everything is merged into entirely one, as said. And peace corresponds to the decisive middle path that makes peace between the opposites of right and left. For peace binds everything together, such that left is merged into right after creation into before creation. This corresponds to God will bless his people with peace. Psalms 29:11. For peace is a vessel to contain blessing. Uktzin 3:12. Since blessings that come from before creation, in which is the source of blessing, is impossible to be channeled below into after creation, other than through peace, which binds everything and merges after creation into before creation. Only then can blessing be drawn from the source of blessing into the entire creation. This is why the priestly blessing concludes with the word peace, and their blessing is adjoined to the prayer of grant peace. For blessing is channeled into creation by merging it into before creation, which corresponds to peace, as said, since blessing is to be spared from and to subdue the curse that is attached to after creation, and by merging after creation into before creation, into entirely one, entirely good, all curses are thereby negated at their source, and all blessings and all good are thereby channeled into the entire creation. This is, God will bless his people with peace. Laws of Proselytes. Law 1. A proselyte enters into Jewish faith through circumcision and immersion overseen by a court of three, Yoreh Day'ah, 268. This is because initially this person was a Gentile from the 70 nations that are attached to the all-encompassing evil that corresponds to the foreskin, as the Rebbe writes, Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 19. So when he comes to enter into Jewish faith, he must be circumcised, and specifically through that mitzvah, he enters into Jewish faith, since it is the all-encompassing rectification. For through subduing the foreskin, the all-encompassing evil that had been attached to him while among the 70 nations is thereby subdued. Then he can enter into Jewish faith, for the essence of Jewish holiness is the guarding of the covenant, which corresponds to circumcision, through which God exalted us above all nations, as the Rebbe says there. After that, he must immerse in a mikveh in order to become a new creature. For the immersion corresponds to disappearing into the waters of the mikveh that correspond to the world of the future, in which we are renewed and become as a new creature, as with repentance, as written, Return us, O God, renew our days. Lamentations 5:21. As discussed in Laws of Koshering Vessels, Halakha 1, and Laws of Purim, Halakha 1. So a proselyte must immerse, so that through that he will literally be renewed and transformed from having a Gentile body to having a Jewish body. This requires a court, and while still in the water, the court informs him of some of the commandments while he accepts the yoke of heaven upon himself. Yoreh Day'ah, 268, 2. This is because the essence of Jewish holiness is the point in every single Jewish person that corresponds to their soul, and all Jewish points receive from the all-encompassing point, as explained in Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 34, and as already explained in Laws of Vows, Halakha 1, a court of three corresponds to a tzaddik rules, as in Israel, his rulers. Psalms 114:2. For they have the power to rule and to judge as they wish. This court of three corresponds to the all-encompassing point, for they are comprised of all Jewish people, who are three, priest, Levite, and Israelite, which is the totality of the Jewish people, which corresponds to the all-encompassing point. That is why a proselyte requires a court to shine into him from their point, which corresponds to the all-encompassing point, so that he will receive an illumination from the point, through which he will attain Jewish holiness, which is dependent upon the point as said. While the proselyte is still in the water, and the three are informing him of the commandments, by their very telling him, with their mouths they are shining the point into him, as in, My mouth will speak wisdom, through which he receives the point and becomes a Jew. That is why, specifically, while he is in the water they tell him, for it is said that it is impossible to restore the soul other than through immersion. Pri Etz Chaim, Shabbat, Chapter 3, Shlah. Shar Ha-Otiyot, Emek Bracha, 7. So while he is in the water, when he must receive a soul, that they then tell him and shine into him an illumination of the point, from which he receives a soul through the immersion. For the point is the soul, as said. That is why circumcision must precede the immersion, for it is impossible to receive an illumination of the point other than through circumcision, since the point rests near the covenant of peace. For as the Rebbe writes, Likutey Halakhot, 34, the foreskin corresponds to disgrace, as in, the foreskin is a disgrace for us, Genesis 34:14, which corresponds to, disgrace has broken my heart, Jeremiah 9:25, which corresponds to a blemishing of the point. Study there. Thus, this proselyte, who was originally an uncircumcised Gentile, for all nations are uncircumcised, Psalm 69:21, as our sages said, Nedarim 3:11. Since the 70 nations are nourished from the breaking of the vessels, from which the klippot that correspond to foreskin, to disgrace, derive their power, must be circumcised, in order to enter into Jewish faith, so as to remove the disgrace and take him out of the breakage, thereby manifesting the covenant of peace, where the light of the point shines for a Jewish person. Then he receives the light of the point from the court of 3 Jewish people while still in the water and is literally renewed, as said, meaning that he leaves the breakage for rectification, which corresponds to a new creature, literally. Law 3. Based on the lesson in Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 59. Study there. Section 1. It is explained there that one who endeavors to bring people close to God must protect themselves so that the klippot shells and the evil of those people will not become attached to them. For this individual, who is endeavoring to bring others close and to make souls, is constructing the holy palace. The way to be spared from the evil of those people whom one is bringing close so that it will not take hold of one's own thoughts is to invite the angels of one's heart, which corresponds to the enthusiasm of the heart, which is accomplished through the judgment that one judges oneself, which corresponds to fire, as in, God judges in fire, Isaiah 66:16. This fire incinerates the evil and the klippot, so that they will not become attached to the heart of the upright individual who is bringing souls close to God. And then, even the holy palace, which is the souls that one is bringing close, will receive the power of this fire, incinerating the klippot from their attachment to them as well. Then, justice comes to light, meaning that the heart is enthused and one sits on a throne, as in establishing his throne for judgment. This corresponds to a faithful metropolis filled with justice. A metropolis is Jerusalem, the holy city, which corresponds to the holy palace, gives form to justice. This corresponds to, at that time they will call Jerusalem, God's throne, and all the nations will gather unto her for God's name, and will never again follow the foolishness of their evil heart. This means that though many nations will come close to God, nevertheless, the evil will not be able to sway their hearts, and they will not follow the foolishness of their evil hearts. For the fire of the angels in the heart that is kindled by judgment, through which Jerusalem is called the holy palace, God's throne. This fire will incinerate the evil, on account of which all of the nations will be able to be brought close to God and yet not follow the foolishness of their hearts, meaning that the evil will not sway their hearts, for the fire will incinerate it. Study all this there well. This is observe my Shabbats. This is the circle with a square inside of it, and the mem and the samach in the tablets, miraculously hung in midair. And I will give them a hand and a name in my house, and a house and a fortune is the bequeath of ancestors. Study all this there well. Section 2. This corresponds to the requirement for proselytes to be circumcised and to then immerse, and that the process of conversion can only be done by a court of 3, which our sages derive from the fact that the verse uses the word judgment in relation to a proselyte, as written, "One judgment shall be for you and for the proselyte." This is because a proselyte, having been very distant from holiness, the ultimate distance, now seeks to leave the defilement and the filth of the nations to enter into Jewish holiness, is therefore unable to approach holiness other than through a court of 3 in which justice resides. That is why, specifically, a court has the power to bring him close and beneath the wings of the Shekhinah. For since they are a court of 3 who have the power to make judgment, since all judgments are in a court of 3, and because the power of justice resides in them, therefore they have the power to bring proselytes close to God. For the evil of the proselytes will not be able to become attached to their hearts, since the fire of their justice will incinerate the evil of the proselytes, as said. That is why judgment is written regarding a proselyte, to tell us that the proselyte requires a court of 3 who are masters of justice, since it is impossible for the proselyte to come close to God other than through justice, as explained in the lesson, in order to arouse the fire of justice so as to incinerate the evil that has been attached to them, as said. Section 3. That is why the proselyte must first be circumcised, for the foreskin is the embodiment of the evil, of the filth of the serpent that is attached to him. For it is impossible to bring him close without first circumcising him and removing from him the foreskin, that is the evil that is attached to him. Only then is it possible to bring him close to the service of God, for the most important thing is to first endeavor to subdue and negate the evil that is attached to them. Thus, if the immersion was done first, before the circumcision, it is invalid. Yoreh Day'ah 268, 1. For first, the evil, which is the foreskin, must be removed from him, and only then can he be purified with immersion and brought close to God. For the most important thing is to remove and incinerate the evil that has been attached to these souls that seek to come close. Since they come from among the nations and the klippot, as written, "This Jerusalem I have placed amongst the nations," Ezekiel 5:5. Therefore, we must first remove the evil from the proselytes through circumcision, and only then purify them through immersion and bring them close to God. Section 4. Circumcision and immersion correspond to the mem and samek and the circle and the square discussed in the lesson, which correspond to judgment and the throne discussed in the lesson. The mitzvah of circumcision, which is the dispelling of the evil, which is the foreskin, corresponds to the dissolving of the forbidden in an admixture of 60, which is through the samech, numerically 60, which corresponds to the Likutey, as in 60 are the Malkote, queens, Song of Songs 6:8, and Malkut corresponds to a double-edged sword, as mentioned elsewhere, Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 30, as in a sword avenging the vengeance of the covenant, Leviticus 26:25, which corresponds to the sword, the knife of the circumcision that cuts the foreskin and dispels the evil. For the power of this sword comes from the fire of judgment, as in God judges in fire, and with his sword, all flesh, Isaiah 66:16. This corresponds to the verses we are accustomed to recite on a day on which there is a circumcision, specifically, add a praises of God in their throats and a double-edged sword in their hands, Psalms 149:6, which corresponds to Malkut, which corresponds to praises of God in their throats, as in Malkut Peh, mouth, Tikkun Zohar, page 17a, which corresponds to a double-edged sword, which subdues, cuts, and removes the foreskin, the blemishing of the covenant, corresponding to evil, as in a sword avenging the vengeance of the covenant. This verse is thus followed by, to exact vengeance upon the nations, to execute upon them written judgment, specifically judgment, for it is the sword that exacts the written judgment upon the nations. Since the sword corresponds to the power of the fire that comes from judgment, which cuts and incinerates the evil, which is the foreskin, as in God judges in fire, and with his sword. Hence, circumcision corresponds to the nullification of the evil through the fire of judgment, which is the sword knife of the circumcision that corresponds to Malkut, to the throne of judgment, and then judgment is brought out to light and sits on the throne. Then we attain the holiness of Shabbat, which corresponds to the circle with a square inside it, which correspond to the mem and samech, as explained in the lesson. This corresponds to immersion after circumcision, which corresponds to the mem, to the square. The immersion is in a mikveh of mem sa, 40 sa, 332 or 572 liters, corresponding to the mem, during which the one who comes to purify themselves disappears into the mem sa of the mikveh, thereby becoming a throne and chariot for the mem, which corresponds to the throne of judgment. This corresponds to, at that time they will call Jerusalem God's throne, and all nations, Nai Kevu, will be gathered unto her, specifically Nai Kevu, as in a Mai Kevi of Mem Sa, which corresponds to the Mem, to judgment. through which all nations will come and convert, as said. Section 5. Hence, it is impossible to bring penitents and proselytes close to God other than through judgment, as said. For this reason, we journey for Rosh Hashanah to tzaddikim, specifically on Rosh Hashanah, for whoever sincerely seeks to come close to God. And it is certainly impossible to truly come close to God other than through the authentic tzaddik of the generation. The tzaddik cannot bring them close other than through judgment, as said. So we journey specifically for Rosh Hashanah, for Rosh Hashanah is the day of judgment. That is why it is the first day of the 10 days of repentance, and why we journey to the tzaddikim to come close to God, for at this time judgment comes to light and incinerates the evil of those who seek to come close, as said. Judgment then sits on God's throne, as in establishing his throne for judgment, for all this takes place specifically on Rosh Hashanah, which is the day of judgment. That is why it is the main time for coming close to God through the authentic tzaddikim of the generation. Our entire service on Rosh Hashanah to manifest godliness to all creatures on earth, such that the distant ones will hear and come, all converting and coming close to God. As we say throughout all the prayers of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, imbue fear of you, our God, upon all of your works, and dread of you upon all that you have created, and may they all bond as one to do your will. Reign, O God, alone, over all of your works. May every creature know that you created it, every form of life understand that you formed it, and everything with a breath in its nostril, and others throughout the prayers, such as, may they all come to serve you. Section 6. This corresponds to shofar. The sound of the shofar that spreads out mightily corresponds to fear, as in, will a shofar be blown in a city and the people not tremble? Amos 3:6. And fear corresponds to fire, to judgment, as in, for your God is a consuming fire, a great and awesome God. Deuteronomy 4:24, 7, 21. That is why through the sound of the shofar, which corresponds to gvurot, to fear, to judgment, is the fire of judgment aroused, as in God's voice hews flames of fire. Psalms 29:7. This is because the shofar of Rosh Hashanah is a shofar of a ram corresponding to Isaac's ram. Rosh Hashanah 16a, which corresponds to the sound of the shofar of Torah giving. Rashi, Exodus 19:13. As we recall the sound of the shofar of Torah giving on Rosh Hashanah in the prayer, you appeared, and the sound of the shofar of Torah giving was accompanied with fire and flames. As written, all the people saw the sounds and the flames. Exodus 20:15. And in many other verses. This was because at the time of Torah giving, all the Israelites were like proselytes, for it was the beginning of their coming close to their Father in heaven, after having taken leave of the defilement of Egypt to enter the holiness of the Jewish people, as Rashi explains, Exodus 24:6. That is why we read the book of Ruth on Shavuot, for Shavuot, which is the time of Torah giving, corresponds to proselytes and penitents coming close, on account of which there were the sound of the shofar with fire and flames at Torah giving, all of which corresponds to the fire of judgment, in order to incinerate the evil that was attached to them from the defilement of Egypt. Furthermore, the Torah was given with fire, the fire of judgment, for the Torah itself is called judgment. But because the fire of judgment was fully aroused at the time of Torah giving, as written, we heard his words from amidst the fire. Deuteronomy 5:21. Therefore, indeed, the people were completely refined from any attachment of evil, as our sages said, charut, engraved, on the tablets. Exodus 32:16. Charut, freedom from the angel of death. Shabbat 146a. For the filth of the serpent had been completely dispelled, since their filth ceased at Torah giving. Shabbat 146a. Through the fire of judgment, that was aroused by the sound of the shofar, that has the power to arouse the fire of judgment, as in, God's voice hews flames of fire, and what happened afterward with the sin of the golden calf was caused mainly by the mixed multitude who were proselytes that must not be converted, for the power of judgment is unable to subdue their evil, as explained well at the end of the lesson. This corresponds to the mem and the samech in the tablets discussed in the lesson. The tablets, which are the Torah, through which the people's evil was subdued and their filth ceased, since the tablets were given with fire, as said, themselves correspond to the mem and samech, to the circle and the square, which correspond to the dispelling of the evil, as said. Thus, when God first appeared to Moses to redeem the Israelites from Egypt, the very verse mentioned in the lesson is written there. An angel of God appeared to him in a flame of fire from within the bush. Exodus 3:2. For since God wanted to instruct Moses to take the Israelites out of the defilement of Egypt and bring them close to God, which corresponds to proselytes and penitents, therefore the angels who correspond to the fire of judgment were immediately aroused, for only through that is it possible to bring the Jewish people close to God, as said. Section 7. Hence, the sound of the shofar arouses the fire of judgment through which the evil is subdued, specifically through which we are able to bring proselytes and distant ones close to God. This corresponds to blow a shofar on the new moon, on the day of the moon's hiddenness, for the day of our festival, for it is statute for Israel, a judgment for Jacob's God. Psalms 81, 4-5. Specifically, judgment. For we must blow a shofar in order to thereby arouse that judgment, as said. This is why before the shofar blowing we recite the entire Psalm 47, which entirely speaks about all the nations coming close to God, of their converting and returning to God, as written, all the nations clap hands, for God is supreme, awesome, a great king over all, corresponding to fear, which corresponds to judgment, a great king over all the earth, for they will all convert and return to him, which is, he will lead peoples beneath us, and he will choose for us our inheritance. Inheritance referring to Jerusalem, Zavachim 119a, for Jerusalem, the holy city, corresponding to the holy palace, is constructed by converting proselytes, as explained in the lesson. Then, the pride of Jacob, specifically Jacob, for Jacob corresponds to judgment, as in a judgment for Jacob's God. All this is aroused through the shofar, which is, God is now exalted through a blare, God through a sound of a shofar, through which judgment is aroused, as said. The psalm thus concludes with, those who came forward from the nations, the nation of Abraham's God, gathered together, which refers to proselytes. For Abraham was the first of the proselytes, as our sages said on this verse, Sukkah 49b, for through the sound of the shofar, which corresponds to judgment, proselytes are converted. We thus recite this entire psalm that speaks of converts before the shofar blowing, for the shofar gathers in all the banished ones, who correspond to proselytes, that is, all the distant ones from God, who are all brought close to him through the sound of the shofar that corresponds to judgment. As we pray on Rosh Hashanah, blow a great shofar for our freedom, raise up a banner to gather our exiles, and bring our dispersed ones from among the nations, as written, on that day a great shofar will be blown, and all the lost ones in the land of Assyria and the lost ones in the land of Egypt will come and prostrate before God on the holy mountain in Jerusalem. Isaiah 27:13. For the shofar gathers in and brings close the lost and banished ones, who are the distant ones from holiness, who are brought close through the fire of judgment that corresponds to the sound of the shofar. Through that is the holy palace that corresponds to Jerusalem constructed, which is, they will prostrate before God on the holy mountain in Jerusalem, specifically on the holy mountain in Jerusalem, corresponding to the holy palace that is constructed by the lost and banished ones who are distant and come to prostrate before God, and come close to his service, all of which comes about through the sound of the shofar, which corresponds to fear, to the fire of judgment. And thus, a shofar was maintained in a court, Sanhedrin 7b, because a shofar corresponds to judgment, as said. Section 8. Thus, all the sounds of the shofar are tripled, as our sages said. The length of a tekiah is like 3 truot. The length of a truah is like 3 sobs. Rosh Hashanah 33b, end quote. Which corresponds to judgment, which is tripled, since judgment is in a court of 3 judges. Thus, judgment corresponds to Jacob, as in judgment for Jacob's God. For Jacob was tripled with ancestry, as in Jacob shevel, literally rope, of his portion. Deuteronomy 32:9. As a rope that is made of 3 threads, Rashi, for Jacob, was comprised of the 3 forefathers who correspond to a court of 3, from whom judgment emerges. Through that we convert proselytes in a court of 3, who receive from the 3 forefathers, essentially from Jacob, whose bed was complete without any blemish. Leviticus, Rabbah 36:5. For until Jacob came to be the 3rd of the forefathers, the decisive factor through whom judgment is facilitated, it was impossible to completely incinerate the evil, which is why Abraham and Isaac, who converted proselytes, were not completely spared from the attachment of evil. Thus, Ishmael was born to Abraham and Esau to Isaac, for judgment had still not come completely into the light to completely subdue and dispel the evil, until Jacob, who was the 3rd, the perfection of judgment, when the evil was completely subdued through the judgment that was complete with him, which is why his bed was complete without any attachment of evil or dregs. Thus, the main sound of the shofar is the truah, as written, "A day of truah it will be for you." Numbers 29:1. And God ascends with a truah, God with a sound of a shofar. Psalms 47:6. For truah is tripled in sound. This corresponds to Jacob, as written, God saw no evil doing in Jacob. He saw no evil in Israel. God, their God, is with them, and a king's truah is in them. Numbers 23:21. For through the truah, which corresponds to Jacob, to judgment, through that, God saw no evil doing in Jacob. He saw no evil in Israel, meaning that there is no evil in them at all, for all evil was dispelled through the fire of judgment, as said. Section 9. This is why, on the 3rd day of the week, representing the 3rd day of creation, which corresponds to Jacob, Zohar, Part 2, 276a, we recite Psalm 82, which speaks of judgment, which is also tripled, corresponding to Jacob, as said. God stands amidst a congregation of God. He judges amidst judges, concluding with, Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you will inherit all the nations, for through judgment will all the nations come close to God. Thus, you will inherit, specifically inherit, for inheritance refers to Jerusalem, the holy city, which is the holy palace that is constructed through the converts. Section 10. We thus recite on Rosh Hashanah, to your judgment, they all stand today, for all are your servants. Psalms 119:91. For through judgment are all people brought close to God, and then they are all his servants, for they will all come to serve him. Section 11. This corresponds to saying to a proselyte who comes to convert, Why have you come to convert? Don't you know that the Jewish people today are downtrodden? Yevamot 47a. It is imperative to first distance them a bit, and by belittling them and distancing them a bit, alluding to them that they do not deserve to come close to us, if they then still desire and declare, I know, and I do not deserve, their evil is thereby subdued and separated from them, as in, Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Ruth 1:14. Orpah corresponds to the evil that seeks to attach itself to the righteous proselyte, such as Ruth, which is set apart by our initial distancing of the proselyte. For this distancing corresponds to thrashing, as in a log that is not catching fire, a body that is not becoming kindled by the flame of the soul is to be thrashed. Zohar, Part 3, 168a. For by attempting to push them away, and their pushing forward, and insisting on coming close despite being distanced, they are thereby thrashing and subduing the evil that is attached to them. This itself corresponds to the necessary judgment, in that the one who is involved in bringing proselytes or penitents close uses his words with judgment, beginning with distancing the individual, which corresponds to judgment, for he is judging them that they are undeserving to come close, pushing them away and showing them distance. But if the individual is firm and says, "Nevertheless, though I am not worthy," they have already accepted the judgment against themselves by withstanding this test of distance, and then their evil is thereby subdued and they indeed become worthy. This corresponds to authentic tzaddikim, sometimes distancing specific people when they first come. All this is a test for the person's benefit, for the distancing is for the purpose of being brought close, as in peace, peace, to the near and the distant. Isaiah 57:19. For it is impossible to bring the distant close other than by their withstanding the test of being distanced, through which their evil is subdued. As said, this is because the distancing of the authentic tzaddikim corresponds to judgment, in that they use their words with judgment and know how to speak with each and every individual in a way that will bring them close rather than distance them, all according to his heart's judgment, with which he assesses, ascertains, and tests what is in the person's heart, if they have come with a sincere heart. So when they withstand the test and insist on coming close, even though they are being very distanced, which corresponds to being thrashed, for through this are all of their inner and outer obstacles broken, the torment they suffer from, other people who seek to obstruct them from coming close to the tzaddik, and the anguish they suffer from, the tzaddik himself distancing them. But when they break through all of these obstacles, the evil that is attached to them is thereby subdued, specifically through which they are able to truly come close to God. Furthermore, by the tzaddik using his words with judgment and initially distancing them, the tzaddik can be spared from bringing close those wicked ones who do not deserve to be brought close. As explained in the lesson, for they certainly will be unable to withstand the distancing and will in fact be distanced by the initial distancing, thereby sparing the tzaddik. Section 12. This corresponds to the 100 sounds of the shofar blown on Rosh Hashanah, which corresponds to the mem and the samech, which together are numerically 100. Through the sound of the shofar, we arouse the judgment, through which the fire of judgment emerges and incinerates the evil that is attached to the holy palace, all of which corresponds to the mem and samech, to Shabbat, to the circle and the square, as discussed in the lesson. So we blow 100 sounds, because mem and samech are numerically 100. Section 13. Thus, we do not blow the shofar on Shabbat, for on Shabbat we do not need to arouse judgment in order to dispel the evil, since all evil is automatically dispelled on Shabbat, as in, "Observe my Shabbats." This is the circle and the square, as cited above. So, since the circle with the square inside it, corresponding to the mem and samech, are automatically rectified on Shabbat, therefore there is no need to arouse the 100 sounds of the shofar. Section 14. This corresponds to arising at midnight, waking from sleep, and making the effort to study Torah and mourn over the destruction of the temple. The destruction of the temple was ultimately on account of the corruption of justice, as our sages said, Midrash Tanchuma, Shoftim, number 1, because the people distorted justice, as written, "You have turned judgment into bitter herbs," Amos 5:7, and many other such verses that speak of Jewish exile and the destruction of the temple. in which the corruption of justice is cited as the cause of the destruction of Jerusalem, see Tur Choshen Mishpat, number 1, for Jerusalem and the temple correspond to the holy palace, as explained in the lesson. Furthermore, because the construction and continued existence of the holy palace was through judgment, as said, therefore the site of judgment was in the temple, which is the holy palace. Since it was in the temple that the great Sanhedrin tribunal sat, from which judgment went out to the entire world, for the continued existence of the temple, which is the holy palace, was through judgment, as said. This is because the sorting out of all holy sparks from among the klippot shells was in the temple, in which all sortings out were accomplished through the offerings and the incense that atoned for all sins, which corresponds to the sorting out of the holy sparks, as known. Thus, judgment was needed there in order to arouse the fire of judgment to incinerate the evil so that it would not become attached to the holy palace. Thus, it was the site of judgment, as said, and through the judgment that took place, there was this fire aroused, which corresponds to the fire on the altar, which incinerated all evil from becoming attached to the holy palace, as said. Section 15. Our sages thus said, why is the Torah reading of Mishpatim, laws, judgments, adjoined to the section of the altar? To teach you that judges should be near the altar. Rashi, Exodus 21:1, which is, as said, that the fire on the altar comes through judgment, so judges must sit near the altar to pass judgment. Section 16. This corresponds to what was contained in the holy palace, the table on the north side, the candelabra on the south side, with the incense altar between the table and the candelabra. Incense corresponds to proselytes, for the ultimate sorting out of the holy sparks from among the klippot was achieved through the 11 spices of the incense, as known, which corresponds to proselytes who are taken out of the depths of the klippot and brought close to holiness. Proselytes, in turn, are aroused to come forward through the hand and the name, which correspond to the circle and the square, as explained in the lesson, and this corresponds to the table in the north and the candelabra in the south, which corresponds to the hand and the name. The hand corresponds to the wisdom that emerges from God's temple, through which one has the power to use one's words with judgment and to establish many students, as explained in the lesson. And that corresponds to the candelabra in the south, which corresponds to wisdom, since the candelabra is the head. Tikuni Zohar 13b. For the oil of the candelabra corresponds to wisdom and intelligence, as in, oil on your head shall not be lacking. Ecclesiastes 9:8, which corresponds to judgment, which is wisdom, as in, God's wisdom is in him to do judgment. 1 Kings 3:28. And the table in the north corresponds to the name, which corresponds to wealth, which corresponds to a table of kings. Rashi, Exodus 25:24, which corresponds to sustenance and wealth. And the table was thus in the north, for wealth comes from there, as in, gold comes from the north. Job 37:22. It is through all of these, the table and the candelabra, that correspond to the hand and the name, that penitents and proselytes, who correspond to the sorting out of the holy sparks from among the klippot, which corresponds to incense, as said, are aroused to come forward, which is why the incense altar stood between the table and the candelabra. Hence, the continued existence of Jerusalem and the temple was through judgment, as said, and the destruction of Jerusalem was on account of the corruption of judgment. So, in the future, the construction of Jerusalem will be through judgment. As written, Zion will be redeemed through judgment, and its captives. Isaiah 1:27. For penitents are aroused through judgment, as said. Section 17. This corresponds to rising at midnight, for the arousal from sleep corresponds to the return of the mentalities, since sleep is their departure and arousal from sleep is their return, and when the mentalities return, judgment, which is dependent upon the mind and wisdom, is aroused. This happens at midnight, for that is the time of judgment, which corresponds to an arousal from sleep, as in, "Arise and awaken to my judgment," Psalms 35:23, which happens specifically at midnight, as in, "At midnight I arise to praise you for your righteous judgments." There, 119:62, specifically judgments. For judgment is aroused at midnight, as written, "At midnight God struck every firstborn, and at that time exacted judgment upon their gods." Exodus 12:29. Similarly, regarding Abraham is written, "He divided the night against them." Genesis 14:15. As Rashi explains there, that night is the time of exacting punishment against the nations. Yalkut Shimoni, Psalms, number 723, which is mainly at midnight, when judgment is aroused against them to subdue and incinerate evil, which is embodied by the nations. This corresponds to the flame of fire that strikes the wings of a rooster at midnight, causing it to crow. Zohar, Part 1, 77b, which corresponds to the fire of judgment that is aroused at this time, which corresponds to Jivurot, judgments, which corresponds to a rooster, which is called a gever. Section 18. Every single individual comes into this world only for this purpose, to sort out from the depths of the klippot shells the holy sparks that have fallen into there on account of Adam's sin or on account of one's own sins from that first lifetime. And the sorting out of the sparks corresponds to proselytes and penitents. Thus, one must guard oneself carefully and judge oneself at all times in order to arouse the fire of judgment, to subdue the evil that is attached to those sparks that one must sort out so that they do not become attached to oneself. That is why indeed a person is in great danger in this world and must judge oneself every single day, reflecting upon one's ways and arousing one's heart to God, which is the essence of hitbadadut, and speaking out one's heart before God, which the Rebbe urged us countless times, as discussed many times in his holy writings. Every individual, from the small to the great, confronts enormous danger in this world on account of this evil that is attached to the sparks that one must sort out, since even the lowest of Jewish people must also sort out according to their level. But because these holy sparks that one must sort out are intermixed within the evil, therefore there are great dangers that the evil will become attached to the individual, which is why our sages said, "Every day one's inclination for evil overwhelms one, and if God would not help one," Sukkah 52a. And elsewhere, our sages said, "Every day a person's inclination overwhelms one and seeks to kill him, and were God not to help him, he would be unable to withstand it." So, there is no strategy to withstand these attacks other than through hitbodet, which corresponds to judgment, as said in the lesson that one must judge oneself, which means secluding oneself with one's maker, and to be judged by oneself over all of one's ways, chastising and rebuking oneself every single day in order to arouse the fire of judgment, to incinerate and subdue the evil so that it will not become attached to one's heart, as said. Our sages thus said, "Do not believe in yourself until the day of your death." Avot 2:4. We have already seen several great tzaddikim and upright revered people who sincerely devoted themselves to the service of God for many years, only to ultimately become trapped in severe sins. As cited in the writings of the Ari, Pri Etz Chaim, Nefilat Apayim, Chapter 2. This phenomenon can be understood with the above. Every individual is involved in this world with sorting out, but especially those who are more devoted to the service of God, who sort out new things every single day, for which reason their inclination for evil overwhelms them every single day, because they have a new inclination for evil every single day, since the evil of those sparks that have come to them now to be sorted out is aroused against them anew every single day. So sometimes they are confronted by sparks that are wallowing the depths of the klipot. And since they are busy sorting them out, therefore the evil becomes very attached to them, so they can suddenly stumble. That is why one must be extremely meticulous to judge oneself every single day and to reflect upon one's ways to thereby arouse the enthusiasm of one's heart so that the flame of judgment will be aroused to incinerate the evil as said. Section 19. This is especially so because every individual is obligated to endeavor to bring others close to God, to foster penitence and proselytes, for that is what you were created for. That is the ultimate civilization of the world, for God did not create it to be chaos, but formed it to be civilized. Isaiah 45:18. That the world would be civilized by human beings, by intelligent people who would devote themselves to the service of God. For whoever is not involved in the service of God is only a beast in human form. As the Rebbe cites several times, for example, Likutey Halakhot, Part 2, 7. Our sages also urged us greatly about this, as brought in the Holy Zohar. Fortunate is the one who holds onto the hand of a sinner. Part 1, 128b. Unquote. Greatly embellishing this person's enormous reward, in that God boasts about him throughout all worlds. This corresponds to the mutual responsibility that every Jewish person has for each other. Sanhedrin 27b. Every single Jewish person is obligated to speak with others every single day regarding fear, awe of heaven, as we request several times in prayers to be privileged to study, teach, observe, do, and fulfill, the essence of which is to be privileged to teach others the pathways and the strategies in the service of God, which is to study, to teach, to observe, to do, and to fulfill, that the study should be solely in order to observe, do, and fulfill. For the study is not the most important thing, but the action, avot. 1:17. Hence, every individual Jewish person is obligated in this, to help others reach repentance and to bring souls close to the service of God. Yet, one must guard oneself extremely well from the evil that is attached to these souls that one seeks to bring close, for which reason judgment is required. To judge oneself every single day, in order to arouse the fire of judgment so as to incinerate the evil and prevent it from becoming attached to one's heart, but also to banish and incinerate the evil from the holy palace, that is, from those souls that one is involved in bringing close, as explained in the lesson. Then judgment is aroused and comes to light, and then judgment sits on the throne. Study all this very well in the lesson. Section 20. Now, judgment is essentially by day. It cannot be carried out by night unless it began by day, and only a final ruling is being given at night, or if both litigants have agreed to begin by night. Choshen Mishpat 5:2. Shak. Number 4. The verse says, House of David, carry out judgment in the morning. Jeremiah 21:12. Which is why judgment is called light, as written. Your judgment will emerge as light. Hosea 6:5. For judgment corresponds to the light of day, since judgment corresponds to wisdom, to the mind, as said above, paragraph 16, which corresponds to the light of day. On the other hand, the night is the departing of intelligence, as known. So, judgment must be by day. And the manifestation of intelligence that facilitates one's ability to use one's words with judgment is mainly by day. However, with nightfall, all executors of judgment are aroused, but with daybreak, they all disappear. Zohar, Part 1, 203b, during which time the Malkut, which corresponds to the throne of glory, to the throne of judgment, descends into the depths to sort out sparks from the klipot shells. So, since the forces of evil are very potent at this time, we are therefore unable to incinerate and subdue them through our judgment. So, nighttime is the time for sleep, which is the departing of intelligence and of judgment, meaning that we set aside judgment for judgment now lacks the power to subdue, and we surrender judgment to God, who himself will execute judgment against the forces of evil. This corresponds to what we recite before going to sleep. I entrust my spirit in your hand, Psalms 31:6. Specifically, in your hand, thereby handing over judgment itself. For judgment corresponds to a hand, as in, my hand will hold on to judgment, Deuteronomy 32:41, in that God himself will execute judgment against them, as in, judgment is God's, there 1:17. Then God himself brings the power of judgment into the Malkut, which corresponds to the holy palace, to the throne, which corresponds to a name, to a circle. And the Malkut then receives the power of judgment and descends with that power of judgment into all the lower worlds, sorting out from the depth of the klipot throughout the time of sleep until midnight. For the Malkut is an avenging sword, corresponding to the sword of judgment mentioned above. This is because nighttime is the main time for sorting out through the Malkut, which corresponds to faith, to a name. For it is the name that goes around sorting out at night, as in, my soul yearns for you at night, Isaiah 26:9. And the ultimate yearning of the holy soul is for the name, as in, for your name and for your commemoration is my soul's desire, there, verse 8. Thus, though there is no judgment at nighttime, nevertheless, we arouse the power of daytime judgment at night, for the final ruling of judgment may be passed at night, as said. Furthermore, one may judge oneself at any time, for regarding oneself one can certainly accept anything. That is why we confess before going to sleep, confessing and accepting upon ourselves the 4 capital punishments, Zohar, Part 3, 29b, in order to arouse the power of daytime judgment, all in order to hand over all of this power to the Malchut, to the throne, so that it will be able to descend and ascend from the depths of the klipot. This is because the ultimate sorting out is through the Malkut, which corresponds to a name. As said, for hand and name, square and circle, correspond to day and night. Hand, which corresponds to wisdom, to judgment, corresponds to daytime, and name, which corresponds to soul, corresponds to nighttime, as in, my soul yearns for you at night. This is because the tzaddik sorts out and draws out proselytes and penitents through these two, the hand and the name, for many souls come to him and cleave to him only because of his name. And when they come to him, he teaches them his wisdom and uses his words with judgment appropriate for each individual one of them. And the name corresponds to sleep, to the departing of intelligence, meaning that he does not speak with them to teach them judgment, to imbue them with his intelligence, but that his name alone spreads throughout the world, through which alone they come to cleave to him. So the main time for sorting out is at night, through the name, which corresponds to the Malkut, as said, but all judgment is handed over to God at this time. For all the executors of judgment are aroused, and we do not know how to conduct ourselves, since there is evil which judgment cannot subdue, as explained at the end of the lesson. So we must hand over judgment to God at this time, as in your hand I entrust my spirit, meaning that God himself should carry out judgment. God himself then brings the power of judgment into the Malchut, into the name, in order to rescue the Malchut from the klipot, from the realm of death, which corresponds to sleep, which is a 60th of death, Brachot 57b, specifically a 60th, which is why we arouse the 60 warriors before sleep, who are all holding a sword, Song of Songs 3:8, and also recite the 60 letters of the priestly blessing in order to protect and rescue the Malkut, which corresponds to the name, to the circle, to the Samech, as explained in the lesson. In order to rescue the Samech, which corresponds to 60 are the Malakoti, from sleep, which is 1/60th of death. We therefore recite before sleep praises of God in their throats and a double-edged sword in their hands to execute vengeance upon the peoples, rebuke upon the nations, to execute judgment upon them, since before sleep we arouse the power of judgment in order to hand it over to the Malchut, to the name, which corresponds to a double-edged sword, as in an avenging sword, to the sword of justice, as said. Section 21. This corresponds to what is stated in the writings of the Adi, that the minds depart from the Zayir Anpin to on high during sleep, and then the Gvurot are channeled into the Malkut by circumventing the Zeir Anpin, on account of which the Malkut is severed and can turn around to be face to face, which is the mystery of Rosh Hashanah, the mystery of the severance, the mystery of sleep and arousal from sleep through the shofar that is blown on Rosh Hashanah. Study in the Kabbalistic intentions. This is as said, that we hand over judgment, which corresponds to the minds, to God, as in, for judgment is God's, and then God himself channels the Gvurot into the minds, which is the fire of judgment, into the Malkut, through which the Malkut is able to sort out, to be reconstructed with completeness, and to subdue the Klipot through the fire of judgment. Then she is able to turn around face to face, for she is no longer afraid of the Klipot. Study the intentions of reciting the Shema before sleep, and the intentions of Rosh Hashanah. Section 22. Hence, at night, the time of the departing of the minds, of sleep, judgment departs from the human being and ascends to God, who himself channels the power of judgment into the Malkut, which corresponds to name, in order to protect the human being during sleep. That is why great protection is then indeed required, which can only be achieved through the power of judgment by day. For to the extent of the good deeds done by day, will one attain protection at night? And all of the good deeds of doing good and avoiding evil correspond to judgment, as in, I reckoned my steps and returned my feet to your testimonies. Psalms 119:59. Then, at midnight, the Malchut is at the ultimate nadir, having descended precipitously, and cries out loudly to be elevated from there, for the power of judgment is increasingly diminished during sleep. That is why whoever seeks to have mercy on the glory of one's Maker and the glory of one's name and soul must awaken with great arousal at precisely midnight, through which one arouses judgment, as in, be aroused and awaken to my judgment, Psalms 35:23, and at midnight I awaken to praise you for your righteous judgments, there 119:62, as said, paragraph 17. Through that judgment, one elevates the Malkut, corresponding to one's name and soul, which is the time to construct the holy palace through the power of judgment. That is why we mourn over the destruction of the temple that was destroyed on account of the corrupting of judgment, and whoever mourns over Jerusalem will be privileged to witness its joy and construction. Tanit 30b. Hence, by mourning over the destruction of Jerusalem, one is thereby involved in its construction, which is the construction of the holy palace, which is why we study Torah at this time. For the Torah is called judgment, since the continued existence of the holy palace is through judgment, as said. All this is done in order to arouse and awaken judgment until the morning, and with daybreak it comes to light and sits on the throne, as in House of David. Carry out judgment in the morning. Jeremiah 21:12. Specifically, House of David. For the House of David corresponds to the Malkut, which corresponds to the throne of judgment. Section 23. This corresponds to tzitzit and tefillin, whose time to be donned begins at daybreak. Tzitzit and tefillin correspond to the circle and the square, to the hand and the name. Tzitzit corresponds to the transcendent intelligences that encircle the mind, corresponding to the circles, as the Rebbe says, Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 8, and they correspond to the throne. For Tekelet is the throne of judgment, Zohar, Part 3, 175a. Tikkuni, Zohar, number 10, page 25b. and with the tzitzit, one rectifies God's throne. The tefillin correspond to the square, for the tefillin must be squared in all its dimensions. Menachot 35a, and they contain 4 sections of the Torah. And the word tefillin is from the root of judgment, as in Pilila tur Orach Chaim 25, since judgment corresponds to the minds, as said, which corresponds to tefillin, which correspond to the minds. Shabbat is the cessation of the evil, which is why we do not need to arouse judgment on it, which is why courts do not sit on Shabbat or festivals, and why we do not lay tefillin on Shabbat, since we do not need to arouse judgment at this time to dispel the evil, for the Shekhinah is resting on this day. Section 24. Thus, before the onset of Shabbat, when all the sparks are ascending to merge into the holiness of Shabbat as it enters, and we fear that the evil klipot might become attached as well, a flame of fire therefore descends to incinerate them. Pri Etz Chaim, Shabbat, chapter 3, which corresponds to the fire of judgment. This corresponds to washing ourselves in hot water on the eve of Shabbat, after which we immerse ourselves in the mikveh, which corresponds to a square, to a mem, the mem, 40, sa of mikveh water. This is because when the fire of judgment descends to incinerate the evil, the judgment then remains entirely as compassion and loving kindness, as waters of loving kindness, as in, judgment will flow as water, Amos 5:24. For judgment is the middle pillar, Tikkuni Zohar, page 17b, which is comprised of compassion and strict judgment, fire and water. This is the mystery brought in the Kabbalistic intentions cited above, paragraph 21, that before the severance, the Malkut was back-to-back with the Zair Anpin, at which time the Zer is comprised of both loving kindness and strict judgment, but with the severance that is caused by sleep every night. And also, on Rosh Hashanah, all of the strict judgments are channeled into the Malkut, leaving the Zair entirely loving kindness. This is, as said, we first arouse the fire of judgment in order to incinerate the evil, so that it will not become attached to one's heart. And then all that fire, which corresponds to Gvorot, strict judgments, are channeled into the Malkut, which corresponds to the Holy Palace, as said, and then the judgment remains entirely as waters of loving kindness, as compassion, as in, your compassion is bountiful, O God. Psalms 119, 156. This corresponds to the immersion of a proselyte after circumcision, which corresponds to the fire of judgment, to a double-edged sword, to the throne. After cutting off the evil, which is the foreskin, through a double-edged sword, judgment then remains as compassion, as waters of loving kindness, which corresponds to the memsah of the mikveh waters. This also explains our washing or immersing in water every morning, as said. This corresponds to what is stated in the Holy Zohar. When nighttime spreads its wings, all the gates of Eden are closed, and the executors of judgments go out into the world, and the world is conducted by the Queen. Part 1, 53b. This is, as said, the minds, which correspond to the gates of Eden, depart at night, which corresponds to the departing of judgment to on high, to God. And then the executors of judgment go out, and the world is conducted by the Queen, which corresponds to the Malchut, the throne, the name, the circle, the Samek, the holy palace. For the power of judgment is channeled to her to execute judgment upon the nations, all as explained above. Understand this. Section 25. This corresponds to the unprecedented prolongation of the exile in our times. All the prophesied ends have come and gone, and it is entirely dependent upon repentance. Sanhedrin 97b. For now, God desires for there to be an everlasting, complete redemption with no further exile afterward. So this inevitably requires that the entire Jewish people will repent and sort out everything that needs to be sorted out, as our sages said. The Scion of David will not come until all souls have been emptied from the container. Avodah Zarah 5a, which corresponds to all of the sparks, as known Etz Chaim 26:2. But it is impossible to make penitence and to sort things out other than through judgment, which incinerates the evil. And then the holy palace is constructed in the spiritual realm through the souls that are brought close to God, after which the holy palace will be constructed on the physical plane as well, which is the construction of the temple literally, as the verse says, the palace will be restored al mishpato, appropriately, literally, to its judgment. Jeremiah 30:18. Specifically to its judgment, for the construction of the temple is through judgment, as said. However, there are wicked people, corresponding to the mixed multitude, who must not be brought close, for the power of judgment will not help in their case, as in, exalt your judgment from before him, Psalms 10:5, as explained well in the lesson. Thus, we usually do not know what to do, how to conduct ourselves regarding this judgment, for how can one bring the distant ones close, for perhaps they are among the wicked who must not be brought close. A mortal human being can certainly not know this for sure, not even the very great tzaddikim, and certainly not the ordinary people. Even Moses stumbled in this by bringing close the mixed multitude, who were the wicked who must not be brought close, such that God told him, "Go down, go down, go down, for your people have corrupted themselves." Exodus 32:7, as explained in the lesson. So, what shall lichen on the wall do? Moses certainly attained complete judgment, for he gave us the Torah that corresponds to judgment, as said, and at Torah giving, when the Israelites came close to their Father in heaven, which corresponds to proselytes and penitents, he was able to arouse the angels, the fire of judgment, with great completeness, as written, "We heard his voice from amidst the fire," Deuteronomy 4:36, and God's voice hews flames of fire, Psalms 29:7, all of which corresponds to the fire of judgment. And indeed, Moses completely subdued the evil, for the filth of the Israelites who stood at Mount Sinai ceased, Shabbat 146a, which corresponds to the complete dispelling of the evil through the fire of judgment, even though afterward the mixed multitude sinned, such that God told him, "Go down, because they were wicked who must not be brought close, for judgment does not help in their case," as said. So all the more can others not rely entirely upon their own judgment, but must judge themselves meticulously over every single thing in order to arouse the enthusiasm of one's heart and then to surrender judgment to God, as in, judgment is God's, so that God himself will imbue one with wisdom and intelligence to be able to use one's words with judgment and be able to know with whom to speak and with whom not to speak, how to speak and when to speak, how and what and how much. For it is impossible for a human being to ascertain this judgment well, as said, especially nowadays, in this exile that resembles the night, when we must surrender judgment to God, as said, for now, in this exile, specifically in these times immediately preceding the Messiah, Moses must inevitably embody in every single Jewish person and lead them in ways that will rectify his blemish in judgment of bringing close the mixed multitude, as said in the Tikkuni Zohar and in the Holy Zohar in several places, for example, Part 1, 25a, 28b. Hence, we must rectify today, through the power of Moses, the blemish in judgment that was caused by the mixed multitude, because judgment is so very obscure, hidden, and concealed, with no one knowing how to ascertain this judgment, since even Moses was demoted on account of bringing close the mixed multitude. That is why it is said regarding the Jewish people in this exile, "She fell Pla-im unfathomably," Lamentations 1:9, and the final end is so very nigh Pla, concealed and hidden, as written, "Until when will the Pla-ot, unfathomable, end be delayed?" Daniel 12:6. All this on account of the niflaut, unfathomable wonders, and hiddenness of judgment, in that we must rectify the blemish of judgment caused by the mixed multitude. For this judgment is very unfathomable and hidden, as in, when some issue of judgment, ipalai, will be unfathomable to you. Deuteronomy 17:8. We must only judge ourselves meticulously, and then to surrender judgment to God, as in, judgment is God's. Section 26. For there are two types of judgment. One is the obligation upon every individual to judge themselves every single day, secluding oneself with one's Maker, and pouring out one's heart before Him, telling Him everything that is on one's mind. End quote. Reckoning one's ways, judging oneself for everything one does, whether it is appropriate to spend one's life doing such things, and so forth. The second type of judgment is to use one's words with judgment, to know how to speak and with whom to speak, and to channel one's wisdom into one's words. This is alluded to in the Rebbe's word in this lesson, where he speaks of the fire of the angel that is elicited from this judgment, using one's words with judgment and judging oneself. These are two separate things. Using one's words with judgment is one, and judging oneself is the other. This is made clearer further on there, where it says that by using one's words with judgment, one is thereby able to teach one's wisdom to students. Now, anyone can judge themselves, but the second type of judgment, which is using one's words with judgment, requires a lot of help from on high to know how to do this. Furthermore, one cannot rely solely on one's wisdom and judgment, for there are wicked people, corresponding to the mixed multitude, whom judgment is beyond helping, and who are the main cause for the protraction of the exile. That is why we must surrender this judgment to God, and God, who knows hidden things, will guide one along the proper path, such that one will ascertain the judgment well, and know how to talk to people, while being able to recognize the wicked who must not be brought close, and not bring them close at all. Then, when judgment is rectified, the temple, which corresponds to the holy palace, will be constructed, and the verse will be fulfilled. I will show them niflaut, unfathomable things. As in the days of your leaving the land of Egypt, Mecha 7:15, which corresponds to the rectification of the hafla'ah, unfathomability of judgment, as in, when an issue of judgment, yipalai, will be unfathomable to you, which is the cause for the hiddenness of the pialaot, unfathomable end. May God have compassion on us and open our eyes to the niflaut, unfathomable wonders of judgment, when Zion will be redeemed with judgment and her returnees with charity. Isaiah 1:27. Speedily in our days. Amen and amen. This is related to earlier. Section 27. This is why specifically Jethro counseled Moses regarding judgment, as written, "You will choose, appoint, they will judge." Exodus 18:21-22. For Jethro, who was a righteous proselyte, whose coming close to God was through this judgment, as said above, paragraph 2, was therefore privileged to add this very section of the Torah related to judgment. This is why the section of Torah giving is adjoined to this section of judgment, for the fire of Torah giving corresponds to the fire of judgment, since it was then that the Israelites came close to God. Section 28. This corresponds to the Tekiah Shavrim Trua, which correspond to the three forefathers, Zohar, Part 3, 230b. The forefathers converted proselytes, as explained in the lesson, which is accomplished through the shofar, which corresponds to fear, awe, to judgment, as said, paragraph 6, as written, "From heaven you made judgment heard, the earth feared." Psalm 76, 9-10. This corresponds to Malkuyot Zikronot Shofrot. Malkuyot corresponds to name, to the holy palace, for name corresponds to Malkut, as we recite in the Malkuyot, God will be king over the entire earth. On that day, God will be one, and his name will be one. Zechariah 14:9. Zikronot corresponds to the judgment of judging oneself, through which one ameliorates the judgment of on high, as the entire prayer of Zikronot speaks of judgment as we recite. You remember the acts of the world and hold all creatures to account. Who is not held to account on this day? Creatures will be held to account. To be reminded, which corresponds to the judgment that one must reflect upon one's ways, since one knows that God remembers everything, that he forgets nothing, and that all of one's actions will be recalled against one on the day of judgment. So one must constantly judge oneself. Shofrat corresponds to the fire of judgment, to God's voice hews flames of fire, as said, paragraph 6. As we recite in this prayer, the entire people saw the voices and the flames, which is as said, for through all of the above we bring proselytes and penitents close to God, which is the essence of Rosh Hashanah, as said, paragraph 5. Section 29. This corresponds to the warden of the synagogue banging on the doors in the morning to awaken people to come to the synagogue. The arousal of judgment is in the morning, for judgment comes to light at that time, as said paragraph 2, as in pass rulings of judgment in the morning. This corresponds to banging, for banging corresponds to judgment and exacting justice, which is the fire of judgment, as in, is not my word like fire and like a hammer? Jeremiah 23:29. For through the fire of judgment, through the banging, we thereby bring all the distant ones close to God. That is why we arouse everyone through this banging to come to the synagogue, the place of communal meeting. In other words, that they all come close to God. Come to the synagogue to devote themselves to the service of God. For through the fire of judgment, which corresponds to the banging, to judgment, which incinerates the evil from the holy palace, all are able to thereby come close to God and go the synagogue, which corresponds to the holy palace, through which all those wishing to come close are thereby able to come close to God. For in the construction of the synagogue is the construction of the holy palace. For the sound of the banging is also the sound of judgment. The sound that arouses judgment, the loud sound, corresponds to the sound of the banging, since that sound itself corresponds to judgment. For through the banging is judgment aroused through sound, which corresponds to the sound of the shofar, as said paragraph 6, since sound corresponds to judgment, as known, Pardes Ramonim 27:3. That is why all the plagues and judgments that Moses exacted upon the Egyptians were done by striking the staff, for striking corresponds to judgment, as said. So we bang 3 times in the morning, which corresponds to judgment, which is done with 3, as said paragraphs 8, 9. And why on Shabbat we do not arouse to the synagogue by banging. Orach Chaim 338:1. For there is no need to arouse judgment on Shabbat, since Shabbat is the cessation of evil, since the Shekhinah rests on Shabbat, as said. Section 30. This is why the blessing, restore our judges, comes immediately after the blessing of who gathers the dispersed. The ingathering of the dispersed corresponds to penitents and proselytes who were initially dispersed and distanced from holiness, and are now being gathered and brought close to God, while all the dispersed and scattered sparks ascend. So, following this is, restore our judges, for judgment is required to accomplish that. And after the blessing for judgment comes the blessing regarding the heretics. May there be no hope for the informants, which corresponds to the wicked who may not be brought close, against whom judgment does not help. We are here asking that they should have no hope, and that they should perish, be uprooted, and cease to be, not causing any harm at all. That will elevate the status of the tzaddikim and the pious. For after they have distanced the wicked, for whom judgment does not help, then judgment is established, and the proselytes will be unable to sway the hearts of the tzaddikim from God, on account of which the next blessing concludes. the support and trust of the righteous. And when the tzaddikim have attained complete judgment, the holy palace is then constructed, which corresponds to the construction of Jerusalem, which is the next blessing, at which point there will be a blossoming of David's dynasty, which corresponds to the throne of judgment, which corresponds to Malkut, which corresponds to David's dynasty, regarding which is said, "His throne will last as the days of heaven," Psalms 89:30, and "His throne will be established through loving kindness, upon which he will sit with truth in David's tent, judging and teaching judgment," Isaiah 16:5, and regarding whom is said, "He will not judge by the sight of his eyes, he will judge the poor with uprightness," there 11:3-4. This is all because the blossoming of the Messiah's dynasty will come about through the rectification of judgment, through which Jerusalem, the holy city, which corresponds to the holy palace, as said, will be constructed. That is why all these blessings are adjoined.